The rain drummed softly on the glass walls of Nova Access Corporation's high-rise headquarters, as if nature itself was trying to warn me. I remember watching the droplets trail down the pane beside my desk, each one racing the other to reach the bottom. I used to pretend they were alive, like little brushstrokes trying to outrun time. But that morning I didn't have the luxury of daydreams. I had a gut feeling, and I should have listened. The office was unusually quiet. Even the usual clatter of keyboards and fake laughter in the break room seemed muted. Whispers floated down the hallway like smoke curling under doors, clinging to shoulders. Something was coming. We all felt it at exactly 10 a.m. An email pinged across the team inbox: mandatory all-hands meeting, conference room 5 effective. Immediately, I gathered my notepad, out of habit more than necessity, and walked with the rest of the team to the glass-walled room at the end of the corridor. My stomach churned, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, though I fought to appear calm to still the tremor in my hands. Inside, colleagues sat frozen, uncertain, like statues awaiting judgment. Then Darren Cole entered, his presence a chill that made entire departments shiver, 2 HR representatives trailing him like spectral extensions. His usual navy suit hugged his frame, and that familiar cruel half-smile which always made my skin crawl was fixed upon his lips. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice a deceptive calm, sharp as a honed blade. "As part of our ongoing strategic alignment, we've had to make some difficult decisions regarding departmental efficiencies." His gaze then impaled me. "Camille Turner," he articulated slowly, each syllable a deliberate hammer blow, "after a thorough performance review, it has been determined that your role is no longer aligned with the goals of this company. Effective immediately. Your position has been terminated." Silence, utter excruciating silence, the kind that makes your heartbeat sound like a bomb inside your ears. I felt the blood drain from my face, my mouth was dry, I couldn't even swallow. No one looked at me, not a single colleague, not Susan from accounting who once cried in my office after a bad breakup, not Jared who I helped get promoted. Not even Linda who sat next to me for 3 years and borrowed my mug every morning. They all stared down at their laps like children trying to disappear. "You may collect your belongings," Darren continued, already moving on to the next slide in his presentation as if he were discussing printer maintenance. "Not getting someone's dignity in public." I stood, but my legs betrayed me. They trembled every step toward the exit. Felt like wading through wet cement. I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and that's when I saw him. Raymond Carter, janitor, 60-something. Always polite, always invisible to everyone else. At the hallway's end he stood with his mop cart, hands folded as if expecting me. Our eyes met. His gaze held no pity, only a serene understanding. I attempted a smile, but my lips trembled. He approached slowly, deliberately, then reached into his pocket. His hand reappeared, clasping something. When he opened his hand, a small, slightly rusted golden key rested in his palm. "It's time," he whispered. I blinked, uncertain if I'd heard correctly. "Time for what?" I asked. He offered a gentle smile, the knowing kind, and said, "To breathe." "Camille," he said, "to finally breathe." I used to think crayons were magic. When I was 5, my mother brought home a small cardboard box of colored pencils from the dollar store. They were dull at the tips, smelled faintly of wood glue, and had no brand name. But to me they were pure gold. I remember sitting on the wooden floor of our cramped living room in rural North Carolina, sketching anything I could imagine. Mountains, I'd never seen; oceans, I'd only heard about on TV; creatures from books I borrowed from the church library. My parents were simple people. My mom cleaned houses, my dad worked at a paper mill on alternating shifts. They loved me, but not in the way that leaves room for dreaming. They loved me like people who are tired, worried about bills, and terrified of risks. "You draw real nice," my dad said once, glancing at one of my early sketches pinned to the fridge. "But art don't feed the stomach. Camille, you need a job that'll keep you off your knees." I didn't understand then what off your knees meant. I do now. By the time I was 10, my bedroom walls were covered in sketches. I used everything: napkins, the backs of homework sheets, brown paper bags. I drew late into the night under the dim light of a desk lamp with a broken hinge. I felt alive when I drew, like I could breathe deeper, wider, like I belonged somewhere, even if it was only on paper in middle school. One of my teachers, Miss Reynolds, pulled my parents aside after a parent-teacher night. I remember sitting just outside the door eavesdropping as she told them I had real talent, that there were scholarships, that art could be more than just a hobby, that someone with my eye could go far. My mother thanked her politely. My father didn't say much, but in the car ride home he said what mattered. "Camille, do you want to end up broke and begging? Do you want to be 30 and still living in our house? We can't afford foolishness." That night I put away my sketchbook for a week. I didn't draw a single line. It felt like I was trying to hold my breath underwater, and the days passed like slow suffocation. In high school I worked part-time at a diner, saving money for college. I chose business administration because it was safe, promising a future. People said I could always draw on the weekends, but I didn't. Most weekends I was too tired or too guilty. By 20 I had an associate's degree, a small scholarship, and a job at a bank. I'd earned the approval of my family and lost pieces of myself in the process. Once during spring break I visited an art exhibit at a local community college. I walked past rows of canvases, paint thick like frosting colors, leaping off the walls. I remember standing in front of one abstract piece for so long. The janitor asked me if I was lost. I was. I didn't say that out loud, but I was. By 23 I landed a full-time job at Nova Access Corporation in the finance department, full benefits, steady pay, a cubicle with my name on a placard. My father said, "Now that's something to be proud of." I smiled, but inside something small and bright flickered one last time before it dimmed. When I first walked into Nova Access Corporation I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd made peace with my choices. The building was all glass and steel reflecting the sky, like it had nothing to hide inside. Everything smelled of fresh carpet and ambition, polished surfaces, quiet elevators, perfect people in pressed shirts and expensive shoes. They gave me a small cubicle in the finance department with a view of a brick wall and a printer that jammed at least once a day. My job: spreadsheets, forecasting, sitting in meetings where men with tight smiles and tight suits argued over decimal points and cost optimization strategies. No one ever mentioned beauty or creativity or the soul still. I told myself this was adulthood, that this was what people meant by success, but I couldn't stop the itch in my fingers. During lunch breaks I started sneaking out to the back garden behind the building, a quiet patch of grass and 3 benches no one really used. I kept a small sketch pad tucked in my bag, its pages soft with wear there under the shade of a stubborn magnolia tree. I'd let my hand remember what my heart had nearly forgotten. I'd sketch the sharp lines of the building, the way sunlight danced on the concrete, the slouch of someone checking their phone in secret. I didn't draw with purpose. I drew to survive. That's where I met Raymond. He was pushing a mop bucket along the edge of the building. When he saw me he stopped, leaned on the handle and tilted his head toward my sketchbook. "You've got the light?" he said, voice gravelly but kind. "My Lorraine used to draw like that." I didn't know what to say. No one in the office ever spoke to Raymond, most didn't even know his name, but I nodded and that was enough. From then on we talk every few days when our paths crossed. He told me about Lorraine, his late wife, a Sunday painter who never tried to sell her work, never cared if it was good enough. She painted because she had to, because as Raymond said, it was the only way she could breathe. She set up a studio in the old tool shed behind our house. He told me once, said it had the best light in the county. I never touched it. After she passed, couldn't bring myself to. I listened, that's all I did at first. Just listened, and in return I told him little bits about myself, how I used to draw on paper bags as a kid, how I got accepted to an art program, but turned it down. How I hadn't told anyone at work that I even owned a pencil. He never judged, never told me I was foolish. He just said, "Lorraine would have liked you." As the years passed our conversations became my anchor. The only moments of truth in days filled with corporate jargon and artificial smiles. My coworkers, they barely noticed me unless they needed a report fixed or file located. Darren preferred a quiet, invisible and dependable staff, and that's exactly how I was. Yet Raymond truly saw me, not just an employee or the spreadsheet girl, but me. Perhaps he sensed even before I did that something within me was slowly fading and that eventually I'd need a path back. I often found myself counting the windows in the office tower opposite mine, 52 each, a glimpse into someone else's life. Behind those panes other people pursued their dreams, clicking away. I used to wonder if any of them ever looked back at me, but perhaps I had faded from visibility long ago. 3 years prior, changes began to ripple through Nova Access. They called it restructuring, more meetings, tighter deadlines, and fewer people. Those who survived the cuts found little reason to celebrate. They worked harder, smiled less, aged faster. I was one of them, the lucky ones. Darren Cole had always been unpleasant, but after the layoffs he grew sharper, like he tasted blood and wanted more. His eyes scanned every room like a predator, looking for the slowest in the herd, and for some reason he chose me. He'd call me out in meetings for missing the bigger picture. Even when I wasn't the one presenting, he CC upper management on minor errors, things that didn't matter. When I got them right, he never said a word. Silence became his weapon, and I stupidly took it. I told myself he was just stressed, that everyone was under pressure, that if I just worked harder he'd back off. But it didn't matter how early I arrived, how late I stayed, how perfectly I formatted those wretched spreadsheets. He kept coming and I kept shrinking. My sketchpad, once tucked safely in the side pocket of my bag, I ended up buried at the bottom of a drawer. I hadn't opened it in months. Every time I thought about drawing again, I heard my father's voice in my head. Art don't feed the stomach. There were mornings I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a suit that fit too well because I had worn it too long. Somewhere along the line I had traded color for compliance, breath for balance sheets. I started sitting alone at lunch. My absence wasn't intentional, it was a consequence of being unnoticed. My presence in the break room faded, my voice hushed, and my laughter vanished. I was quite simply disappearing. Raymond, observant yet initially quiet, began to notice. He would watch me as he passed in the hallway. One day he stopped, remarking, "You're walking like you've got chains around your ankles." I managed a weak smile. "Just tired, Raymond." He didn't return it. "No, Camille, it's not tired, it's something heavier." I yearned to cry, right there in front of the janitor, with his mop and his too perceptive eyes, but I didn't. I swallowed the feeling, as I always did, and walked away. That night, I went home, opened my drawer and pulled out my sketchpad. I stared at the blank page for a long time. I couldn't draw, my hand hovered over the paper like a ghost. I didn't know where to begin or if I was even allowed to begin anymore. I closed the book and put it back. Some people burn out in flames. Me, I was fading one spreadsheet at a time. I don't remember much of the walk back to my desk. Just the cold hum of fluorescent lights and the click of my heels echoing louder than they should have. My name still hung in the air like a bruise. Camille Turner terminated, effective immediately, like I was a spreadsheet reviewed, deemed irrelevant and deleted. A cardboard box was already waiting for me on the edge of my desk. HR efficiency at its finest. Someone had even started packing for me. My framed photo of Mom, a ceramic mug that said "Introverts Unite." Separately, the little plant I'd nursed through 4 winters, and my sketchpad, dusty, untouched, still closed. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the items of a life I no longer belonged to around me. People went back to typing like nothing had happened. No one made eye contact. No one said goodbye. That was the part that hurt most. Not the job, not Darren's smug voice, but the silence. The way 30 people could pretend you'd never existed. I placed the last few items in the box, lifted it into my arms, and made my way down the main hallway, one last time. Each step felt heavier than the one before. I didn't know where I was going, home maybe, or to the car, or into some abyss where all the invisible women go. And then I saw him. Raymond stood just beyond the hallway bend. Next to his mop cart, watching me. He didn't speak right away. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. He walked toward me slowly, gently, took the box from my hands and set it on a bench by the wall. Then with a steady hand he reached into the front pocket of his gray uniform and pulled out a small object, a key. It looked old, golden, slightly rusted around the edges. The kind you'd find in an attic or a storybook. He held it out in his palm like it was something sacred. "It's time," he said softly. I blinked, confused. Time for what? Raymond's eyes met mine. There was no pity in them, no sadness, only calm and something else, something like conviction to breathe. He said, "Lorraine always told me breathing isn't just about lungs, it's about the soul. Camille, that studio has been waiting for you for far too long." My throat tightened. He nodded, handing me a folded paper. On it, 17 Sycamore Lane was written in careful, blocky handwriting. I looked at the key, then back at him. "I don't understand." "You don't need to," he said. "Not yet." I stood there frozen, the key warm in my hand as if it had been waiting for my palm all this time. No one had ever given me anything like this before, not a key, not trust, not belief. Raymond smiled a soft weathered smile. It's yours now, Lorraine would have wanted it that way. He didn't wait for thanks. Didn't make a speech, just turned and pushed his cart down the hallway, disappearing, like always quiet, constant kind. And I stood there clutching a key to a place I'd never been but somehow already felt like home that night. I didn't sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed with the key still in my hand. Its worn metal pressing gently into my skin. I must have turned it over 100 times as if holding it long enough might whisper some clarity into my ears. Severance pay, unemployment forms, rent. The practical side of my brain screamed focus on survival, but the rest of me, the part one thought had gone silent long ago, whispered something softer. Around midnight I got in my car and drove. The streets were empty, rain still trailing down the windshield in slow lazy lines. Street lamps passed like ghosts. I followed Raymond's directions. Left on Maple right past the old train depot. Then down a quiet street lined with sagging porches and sleeping houses. 17 Sycamore Lane was a modest home with a small front yard, a crooked mailbox, a garden known missing one eye. It looked ordinary, the kind of place people forget exists, but at the end of the gravel path behind the main house stood a small detached building with faded blue siding and a slanted roof. A warm yellow porch light glowed above its door. I stepped out of the car and approached slowly, the key clutched tight in my fist. The lock was stubborn. I had to jiggle it twice before it gave way with a soft click. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The air smelled of old paint, cedar and thyme. It was a single room, maybe the size of a small classroom, but it felt vast. Sunlight must have streamed in during the day through the tall windows, now draped with gauzy curtains. Wooden shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars of dried brushes, tubes of half-used paint and sketchbooks stacked like diaries. A sheet-draped canvas stood in the room's center, untouched by me. Instead, my fingers traced the worn work table, brushing over dusty charcoal pencils, a folded apron and a cracked ceramic mug with paint still clinging to its rim. This wasn't merely a room, it was a life paused mid-breath. Tucked beneath a jar of buttons on the table, I discovered an envelope bearing my name in slanted, careful script. Inside was a letter from Raymond Camille. Lorraine always believed this studio had a soul. She said the walls soaked up every brushstroke, every sigh, and gave it back tenfold. When she passed, I couldn't bear to enter it, but when I saw you sketching behind the building that day, I knew you've got the same light in your eyes. This space, it's yours now, not charity recognition. You are an artist even if the world tried to convince you otherwise. Life is too short to live someone else's dream. Raymond, I sank into the nearest chair, my chest teething with a mix of grief and something that felt frighteningly close to hope. For a long while I sat there in silence, then without thinking, I reached for a pad of paper in the drawer. My hands moved on their own, shaking slightly. I found a stick of charcoal, cracked but still usable. I turned to a fresh page. I and drew a line. It was jagged, too hard, not perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing again. It started with one line, then another and another. Every morning I returned to Lorraine's studio like it was church. The sun poured in through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like whispers from her past. I didn't plan what I drew, I just let my hands remember. At first it felt like exhaling. For years I held my breath, then finally began to draw what I saw: cracked teacups, garden flowers, and the gentle curve of Raymond's back as he tended to the tomatoes. Page after page I filled with everything from nonsense to fury. Some drawings I tore up before they even dried, others I taped to the wall like small affirmations. You are still here, you still matter. Raymond would visit often, sometimes bringing a sandwich, other times just his quiet presence. He never interrupted, simply sitting in the corner, sometimes humming a low, tuneless melody like a heartbeat. Once, as he handed me a cup of peppermint tea, he remarked, "You've got more color in your cheeks." "I think it's charcoal dust." I smiled. He smiled back, but gently, "No, it's something else." I wasn't earning anything yet. The severance package from Nova Axis was enough to carry me for a while, and I dipped into what I'd saved over the years. Money I thought I'd use for some rainy day that apparently had arrived. Still, there was fear, always fear. Fear that I was wasting time, that I'd run out of money and this fragile, beautiful thing I'd found would vanish. Every time doubt crept in, I'd go to the corner where Lorraine's old smock still hung from a hook. I'd touch the worn cloth stained with reds and blues and greens. It reminded me that someone had lived here before me and she had dared. The first time I sold a piece it was almost an accident. Raymond's niece Angela came by one afternoon with her newborn. I was sketching the baby's profile just for practice. She looked at it and asked if she could buy it. "It's just a sketch," I said, embarrassed. "It's him." She said, "That's enough." She paid me $50. I cried after she left. Not because of the money but because someone looked at something I made and saw value. It changed something inside me. Word spread, slowly but surely. Angela told her friends. I posted a few things online. I created a simple website. Nothing fancy, just a portfolio and contact form. Orders trickled in: pet portraits, nursery art illustrations for someone's self-published poetry book. I began saying yes to things I would have once laughed at: a mural for a cafe, a painting of someone's backyard garden, a logo design. I was learning to live by brush, stroke by color, by gut. Within 6 months, I had a small list of returning clients. I was making enough to cover rent, and yes, I insisted on paying rent to Raymond, even though he grumbled. Every time I handed him the envelope, I bought new supplies, painted the walls, a soft cream, installed brighter lights, but I left the essence of the place untouched. Lorraine was still here in the quiet corners, and the way the room held warmth like a memory. On a shelf above the work table I placed a photo I found buried in one of her sketchbooks, a black and white image of her laughing in front of a canvas, her hands covered in paint. Some days I'd whisper to it, "Just to thank you." Just so she knew. The fear never completely left me. I clung to the edges, especially during quiet weeks, but every time I held a pencil I felt stronger. I wasn't where I wanted to be. For the first time I wasn't running from who I was, and that was enough. 2 years passed and the studio became my world. Camille Turner's name began appearing in local newsletters and galleries, often accompanied by a humble description: charming local artist known for evocative line work and emotion-driven portraits. I recall laughing the first time I saw it. Me known as an artist? The quiet girl in the cubicle never dared to dream of such a thing. Eventually I had enough work to require administrative and scheduling assistance. A colleague started coming in twice a week. I cultivated a client list, shipped art to 3 different states, and proudly displayed my murals in 3 cafes. None of it was glamorous, none of it was simple, but it was all mine. Every single brushstroke led back to him. Raymond still came by, though less frequently. Now, his knees were bothering him, and the winter air made his joints ache. But when he did visit, he walked around the studio like a man visiting a chapel. I think in his mind it still belonged to Lorraine. In a way it did, and maybe now it belonged to both of us. One morning as I was rearranging some supplies, I found a photograph tucked in an old drawer I hadn't opened in months. It was small crease at the edges. A black and white image of a younger Raymond and Lorraine standing beside a lake. Arms wrapped around each other. Smiling so naturally it stopped my breath. They must have been in their 40s. He looked more relaxed, she looked radiant, cheeks full of joy, hands smudged with paint, like always. There was so much life in that photo, so much loss now that she was gone. An idea took hold of me. It wasn't commissioned, it wasn't paid for, it didn't have a deadline, but I knew the moment I touched the paper that it might be the most important thing I'd ever make. For weeks in between orders and online workshops, I worked on the painting in secret. I used every technique I knew, poured every part of myself into it. I didn't recreate the photo, I reimagined it. I painted Raymond and Lorraine as they might have been older now, wrinkles, deeper hair, whiter but together, sitting on that lakeside bench, her hand in his, still painting. Still laughing, still whole. The day I finished I cried. Not sad tears, something else, something deeper, like closure, like reverence. I called Raymond and told him I had something I wanted to show him. He arrived wearing his best jacket, the brown corduroy one with the elbow patches. His hands trembled slightly. When he held the warm mug of tea I handed him, I led him into the back room of the studio where a finished painting stood covered by a linen cloth. "I have a gift for you," I said. He looked at me with tired but kind eyes. "Camille, you don't owe me anything." "I know," I said, smiling softly, "but I owe her." I pulled the cloth away. Raymond stared. His body went still, like even breath might shatter the moment. His eyes with tears then overflowed without warning. He reached forward, not to touch the canvas, to study himself against the table. How he whispered, "How did you know?" "I found the photo." I said quietly. The rest was imagination and gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak. We stood in silence. The painting glowed beneath the skylight. Lorraine's eyes sparkled. With that mischievous joy I imagined she must have carried her whole life. And Raymond, well, he looked like the man I knew, just a little more at peace. After a long pause he turned to me, voice trembling. You didn't just give me a painting. He said, you gave her back to me. I reached out and took his hand, and you gave me a future. These days I wake up before the sun, not because I have to, but because I want to. The studio is quietest in the early morning, before emails, before orders, before the world remembers I exist. I make coffee, pull on my paint streak hoodie, and sit by the tall window with a fresh canvas and a lab that finally knows peace. Sometimes I still hear echoes of that office life. The clicks of keyboards, the flat tone of Darren's voice, the weight of feeling unseen, but they've grown quieter like voices. Coming from a house I no longer live in, I haven't spoken to anyone from Novi Access since the day I walked out. No one ever reached out. No apologies, no closure, and honestly I don't need it because what I have now, better. A few weeks ago I got a call from a children's book publisher. They'd seen my online portfolio. One of my illustrations had been shared in a parenting group, and they wanted to offer me a long-term contract to illustrate a full series, not just one book, a whole series. When I hung up, I sat in the middle of the studio floor surrounded by brushes and fabric and scraps of ideas. I laughed, a big open ridiculous laugh that echoed off the walls like a choir. I didn't even realize I was crying until I tasted the salt on my lips. Lorraine would have loved that moment. So would Raymond. I still keep her photo on the shelf next to a fresh jar of brushes and a tiny sketch of the magnolia tree I used to sit under, behind the Novi Access building, full circle, but better because now the tree lives only in memory and the memory belongs to me. Last week a young woman named Alyssa stopped by the studio. She'd been following my work online and asked if I ever took apprentices. She looked like me. Years ago, eyes full of something wild and quiet, fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her thrift store sweater. I said yes, because someone once made space for me and now it's my turn. As I stood alone in the studio that night, my reflection in the tall window revealed a messy bun, pain etched on my cheeks, fingertips, and even my neck, yet I looked alive. Not perfect, not rich, not famous, but truly seen. Raymond once told me that the right doors open at the right time, and it's our courage that leads us through them. Back then I didn't grasp his meaning, now I understand. Sometimes the door is literal and rusted, behind a quiet house on Sycamore Lane. Other times it's a canvas, a sketch pad, or a single trembling line drawn in the dark, but it's always the moment you stop seeking permission to be yourself. The world didn't hand me that key, Raymond did. Lorraine. Now I hold that key not with fear but with purpose. Because I finally know who I am, Camille Turner. I am an artist and I am home.